Integrating Quotations from Shakespearean Plays by Laura Hand. Let's look at a couple of things that you need to know before starting your essay. We're going to start with the writing prompt. Here's a snapshot from your writing prompt posted on Canvas. There are a few questions that you need to have answers to before you begin. What are you being asked to do for this assignment? Do you need to have additional sources, or are you just focusing on one primary text? What do you need to look for in your primary source? And do you understand the key terms that are being used in the writing prompt? So let's look at some of those key terms. Professor Watts wants you to consider explication, close reading, and direct quotation. You are going to perform an explication by doing a close reading of a direct quotation. So these key terms build one on the other. Let's start at the top. According to the critic M.H. Abrams, an explication is a relatively short analysis which describes the possible meanings and relationships of the words, images, and other small units that make up the text. Writing an explication is an effective way for the reader to connect the text's plot and conflicts with its structural features. A simpler definition of an explication is simply unfolding, as in a flower unfolding petal by petal. You are going to unfold a direct quotation from the play Hamlet by performing a close reading for your explicative essay. What is your task? You are to choose one passage of approximately 12 to 14 lines from the play Hamlet and perform an explication. You don't need any additional sources, but you do need to know the rhetorical devices and terms that Professor Watts has been teaching you all semester to perform an explication of a passage. Let's look at the structure. Here's another snapshot of the middle part of your prompt on Canvas. Professor Watts has outlined a rough idea of what your essay is going to look like, but here are some questions that you need to answer. Based on the primary source, what claim do you want to make in your essay? What section of the text did you find most compelling? What rhetorical devices did you find in the text that you want to explore and expand upon? I recommend making a list of all of the possible passages and their rhetorical devices that you see in the text to give you the groundwork you need to actually formulate your thesis and produce your paper. Having as many options as possible allows you several avenues to make your final decision about what your thesis is going to be and how you're going to write your paper. Let's look at Professor Watts' sample. You need to have an introduction. Make sure that you introduce the play, the year that it was performed, its plot, and so on. Then include something like this. On the surface, X's speech to Y is an explanation by whoever the speaker is to whoever the audience is. Then, in a few sentences, summarize the plot or what's going on in the specific passage that you are going to explicate. The first part of your introduction is going to introduce the play as a whole. Then you're going to narrow your focus to a specific passage, and then you're going to further narrow that focus by explaining what's going on in that specific passage. That leads us up to your thesis, where you make your claim. She recommends using a structure similar to this. Beyond the surface meaning, this speech is about blank. This is where you would indicate your claim or thesis, the point you want to make about the speech's intentions, if you're looking at a speech. If you're not looking at a speech, you still need to make a claim. What points do you want to make about the passage that you're looking at? Secondly, the body paragraphs of the essay are going to focus on one of the sub-elements that you see in the passage. Some examples she's listed here are word choice, symbol or symbolism, and she says that there's another list below on the prompt of other examples that you can look at. I would also consider some of the rhetorical devices that you've discussed all semester. These are going to help you build out your brainstorming and make your outline. It is a good idea to put the term in the topic sentence. This means that you focus in on every device you're going to talk about in the very first sentence of your paragraph. A lot of students forget to do this, and it leads to a broken structure or confusion within their essay. The more focused you are, the easier your paper is going to be to read. Then you will end with a conclusion. Do not simply repeat the introduction. You have spent all of this time in your essay getting somewhere. Where is it? Don't return to where you began. Leave your reader thinking about what you wrote and why it was important. Let's look at some of the brainstorming examples Professor Watts posted. She's listed a couple of questions that might help you start to brainstorm what your thesis could be or what topic you want to focus on. Brainstorming can be very helpful when getting your essay started. I recommend that you identify several passages that you might want to work with and write down all of the rhetorical elements you see within that passage. Write down some unique or unconventional ideas that you have about the text you're looking at. But you need to make sure that they're still logical, and you need to be able to support your idea by explicating the text. Here are just a couple of the questions that she has posted. How does each sub-element you've chosen contribute to proving your point? How does the speech look? So if you're looking at structure, you're going to consider things like shape, stanzas, line length, caps or not capsed. I would add punctuation to this list. These are elements that you're going to look at of how was your passage written to make the point that you're trying to make. What type of rhyme scheme or meter is there? Is your passage a rhymed passage? Is it part of a sonnet? Is it part of prose? Is it part of verse? Look at these different elements as a way to explicate your section. Read it out loud. This will help you identify some of the sounds and rhythms within the passage. Does it change or is it constant? What is the effect of this rhyme or meter on the point that you want to make? What images are created through the word choice, the metaphors, or the simile? Is there a dominant image in your passage? How does the imagery inform your thesis? I would also add, how does imagery build the overall theme of the section that you're looking at? What allusions and references are there? Do you need to look up any or ask about them? I would add, is there any vocabulary that you don't know or don't understand? A lot of text will have footnotes that will be very helpful for understanding some of the language and terminology you see within Shakespeare. What are the things and colors of the speech? What impact do they have? What do the words of the speech mean? Analyze the diction being used. The words chosen and put on the page are there for a specific reason, so what do they mean? Who is the speaker? Can you characterize him or her? Who is the intended audience of this particular passage? What is the scene? What happens? What doesn't happen? Are there any surprises? Is there a conflict? Is there ambiguity? Is there resolution? Are there any tensions? What do you notice about the emotional setting of your particular passage? Is there anything else that you can talk about in this passage that wasn't listed here? Think back over all of the lectures that you've had this semester and all of the reading that you've done. I'm sure you can come up with a few things that were not included on this list. How do you select your quotations? You need to select quotations that have interesting elements that you can talk about. Some of the things that we just described on the previous slide are included again here. What do the line breaks look like? Is there imagery? Was the diction special? Is there any sort of interesting syntax or punctuation? Is there metaphors or similes? How is the theme or tone established? These are all elements you can look at to help you select a quotation. Consider selecting a quotation that also speaks to the ideas or themes of the larger work, or consider analyzing how this quotation plays into the theme of the whole play. You need to be able to explicate not only the passage that you are looking at, but how it drives and fits in with your idea as the overall whole. Your passage needs to meet the line requirement established in the prompt. The entire passage will need to add or support your thesis. Do not select a 12 to 14 line section and then only analyze 2 to 3 of those lines. You need to engage with the entire selection. So choosing a passage that has multiple elements throughout the entire passage is going to be very important to the overall success of your essay. How do you integrate quotations? You will need to integrate quotations from your play into the paragraphs just as you would with any other quoted source. You should introduce the play, the act, the scene, and the lines. There are several ways to do this through context, signal phrases, or in-text citations. If your quotation consists of dialogue, you need to introduce who is speaking. You need to know the difference between verse and prose because there are different methods for quoting one or the other. The following slides are going to briefly go over those differences. Now let's look at an actual essay. This is an essay I wrote not too long ago for my Shakespeare class, where we had to do an explication of one of Shakespeare's plays. So you'll notice here that I have some color coding going on, just to help you break this up and see what part is what. So first I want to talk about my signal phrase. I've highlighted my signal phrase in blue. You can see I have the name of the play, In Twelfth Night, and then I introduce the characters speaking in this particular quotation. Sir Toby says to Sir Andrew, the quotation, and then the response, to which Sir Andrew responds. So this is a split signal phrase, and I've used this type of signal phrase because my quotation is dialogue. If you're not quoting dialogue, you may not need to do a split signal phrase like I've done here, but this is a quick and easy way to do dialogue for short quotations. Obviously, the quotation itself is what is in pink. You have the first line of dialogue from Sir Toby, "O knight, thou lackest a cup of canary. When did I see thee so put down?" To which Sir Andrew responds, "Never in your life, I think, unless you see canary put me down." So between these two lines, we have this little banter between the two characters that I'm looking at. This becomes important to me because I'm comparing these two characters. I'm going to explicate the dynamic of their relationship. So I have chosen a quotation that shows that dynamic. You want to do something similar. Support your thesis by choosing a quotation or a passage that supports the idea that you put forth in your thesis. Finally, I have my citation information here at the end, in green. When citing a play, you need to cite the act, the scene, and the lines that you are quoting. Now there are other rules and guidelines for this, and there are some rules about adding the name of the play to the quotation or to the information inside the parentheses, but because I introduced it in my signal phrase, it's not as necessary or even necessary to put, say, Shakespeare's name or the name of the play within the parentheses. There will be a MLA PDF handout to accompany this video that will go over some of the various nuances of different citation methods. I'm just covering the basics of two types here. Now let's look at a long form quotation. Because you're choosing a longer selection, 12 to 14 lines, you might end up doing a long form quotation like I have here in the pink box. Again, I have started with a signal phrase. Now, because this particular essay had multiple sources, I went ahead and reintroduced the name of the play that I was looking at. However, since you're using a single play as a single source in your essay, you don't really need to reintroduce the play every single paragraph. I do want to point out that this is my topic sentence for this paragraph, and you can see that I've named two rhetorical devices here. I'm going to be looking at dialogue and then the action of the characters. So this kind of plays into characterization. The actions they take are based on their characters. So you can see how I've followed Professor Watts's request that you introduce the elements that you're going to be explicating within your signal phrase, or in your topic sentence, I apologize. This is a longer signal phrase. I've done a complete sentence here, but I do introduce the characters that are going to be speaking in the dialogue of my quotation. You can see that you need to introduce a long form quotation with a colon instead of a comma like you do in short form. You do not need to use quotation marks unless you see them in the original text, but as part of your quotation, you do not need the quotation marks at the beginning and end like with a short form quotation. If you are quoting dialogue or the parts that you are quoting include the name of the character in the original script, you need to include the name of that character. And so you do that by doing it in all caps followed by a period. Now there are some other formatting guides that might tell you to use a colon here, but standard MLA says a period is fine. Then you have the lines of dialogue, and as closely as you can, you want to replicate how that dialogue or that passage looks in the original text. So I have followed all of the punctuation that is in the original text according to the Norton Shakespeare guide that I'm using, and I've included the stage directions that appear on that page. I've included areas where there was italics in the original text, and then I've also included the inline stage directions as well. So you want to replicate how the passage looks on the page. You also need to make sure that you indent your selection 1/2 inch if you're using 4 lines or more. If this was less than 4 lines, we would have run it into the text just like the last example I showed you. So you can see here that I have done my best to replicate how it looks in the original text. I did cut a number of lines out of dialogue, so that's why there's these 3 dots here. That shows that's an ellipsis mark, and it shows that I removed about 3 lines of dialogue between when Olivia says this statement and Sir Toby responds. So if you choose to cut part of your quotation out, you need to make sure that you follow MLA guidelines for shortening a quotation. And then, as always, I have my citation information here at the end. Again, because I've introduced the play earlier, I don't need to include the author's name or the play in my parentheses. I just have the act, the scene, and the line count. I hope this helps. If you still have further questions about how to do a long form quotation, or this example doesn't exactly fit what quotation that you've selected to explicate in your essay, feel free to reach out to me. Again, there will be a PDF handout that goes along with this video that has some additional information about MLA guidelines for different quotations, but you're always more than welcome to email me and ask me questions. Finally, to wrap this up, let's look at an actual page from Hamlet. I have selected the page that includes Hamlet's famous soliloquy, the to be or not to be speech. It is in Act 3, Scene 1, according to the folio version that's found in the Norton Shakespeare book. The reason I've selected this particular passage, A, it's super recognizable, but also this page happens to be a perfect example of how to tell the difference between verse and prose. So you can see here on page 396 that we have sort of this jagged right-hand margin where the lines break before they get to what the margin would be. This is a good indication that this is in verse. But if we look at page 397, we can see here right after Ophelia says, "What means your lordship?" that the text shifts and starts to go all the way to what the margin is. So we have this nice clean right-hand margin line. This indicates a shift to prose. So the rules for citing quotations are different between citing verse or poetry and citing prose. So you need to make sure that you know the difference between the two and that you can identify it in the passage that you are using. I've given an example of a brief 3-line or less quotation of prose here in bold on the right-hand side of the screen. So I've done a short signal phrase, just Hamlet says, comma, and then I begin my quotation. Now the reason I included these short lines is to show you how to do the punctuation for line breaks. So you can see here that I have these additional slashes between what would be the lines found here on this page on 396. So when you are quoting verse or any form of poetry, and you're doing a short form quotation like this, you need to include the slashes for line breaks. Now this includes putting the slashes even if there's other punctuation at the end of the line or if there's no punctuation at the end of the line. That does not matter. If the line is broken, you put a slash. Now I don't know that you'll run into this using Hamlet, but if you were to quote poetry and there happens to be a stanza break where there's a space or gap between one stanza and another, you would simply indicate that with 2 slashes instead of 1. But I don't think you'll have that in this play. You can see that I've done my best to replicate all of the punctuation that I found in the Norton version. Some adaptations and books will have different punctuation because the punctuation is sort of subjective depending on the publisher. So it's always important to follow as closely as possible when you do a quotation and you use the punctuation that you see in your source. So if you were to look at this quotation from another source that's not the Norton, you might see different punctuation. So always double check your quotations and make sure that you got the punctuation correct. The last thing I want to point out is this ellipsis here at the end. Some of you are most likely familiar with this, but for those of you who are not, when you break a sentence or a line in your quotation mid-sentence, meaning you don't get to the end of it, you want to use an ellipsis to show that you stopped that quotation before it stopped in the original text. So you can simply just tack on an ellipsis here at the end. Now, a lot of students think that that rule applies to where you begin a quotation as well. I've seen quite a few drafts where students will put an ellipsis here at the beginning to show that they came into their quotation mid-sentence. But the MLA guidelines state that you only need the ellipsis at the end of your quotation if you break off mid-sentence. If you start mid-sentence, you don't need the ellipsis at the beginning. And as you can see here, I have the act, scene, and line count for this particular quotation. And I realized when I was recording this that I have a typo here. This is actually line 63 through 65. That's why there's 3 of them. So ignore my minor errors there. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I would be happy to look over drafts with you. I would be happy to talk to you about your quotations, about your thesis. Any questions you have about your essay, feel free to reach out and ask me. As you can see, yes, correction, I'm quoting the lines 63 through 65. So again, check the handout that goes with this video. If that doesn't answer your question, feel free to send me an email. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Good luck on your essays, and I hope to hear from you all soon.